There's a history in all men's lives. Sometimes we're reminded of history by the physical structures of the past. Husband of 53 years, father of 5, grandfather of 10, 3 tours in Vietnam, career naval intelligence officer. Richard Life is going to share with us his personal experience with the fall of the Berlin Wall and what its fall means for each of us today. Please join me in welcoming Richard Life to the stage.
First, I want to thank the committee for inviting me. It's truly an honor to appear here with your group. Second, I want to thank my coach, and that would be Michelle Fujimoto, who's going to be moving the slides for me. And thirdly, I would like to thank Rosemary Stewart and her husband, Fred Paliani, because Rosemary was in our Sunday school class back when she was in high school, and then she went to Moscow when we went to Moscow to serve as a nanny for other embassy folks. So, and it was Fred then who submitted my name so that I could be up here. So thank you all for that. The Berlin Wall came down. So what's the big deal, for crying out loud? Well, you see, the whole thing was that it triggered a major change between the two dynamic superpowers and ideologies of the 20th century, Lenin's communism and Jefferson's representative democracy. That was one of the big things. Who here has ever lived under communism? Obviously, we've just heard from Ariel. Who has lived under communism or a despotic monarch or dictator, or any other form of totalitarian rule? Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, that of course included the GDR, or the German Democratic Republic, I'll use that term, GDR. And totalitarian rule, though, meant that a small hand-picked group of elite men controlled every aspect of their people's lives, and that was from the cradle to the grave. And Ariel has given us some insights to that. Thank you, Ariel, for helping to set that up for me here. Okay. Now, the east side of the Berlin Wall, I have it up here, and I'll give you an invitation to come up later, but you can see it was white on the east side, and that was to create a shooting silhouette. Because if anybody was fortunate enough to, in their escape, to get to the wall, they would stand out and be a really good target for the two border guards in the watchtowers to be able to kill them. And that's what they were ordered to do. 28 years the wall existed, and it was modernized 4 times. So the second iteration of it, they went through and they tore down all structures and created a 75-yard land, which the Germans called a death strip, or the death strip. Now come with me right now, if you will, and we are going to use our imaginations, and we're going to try to escape. Okay, we wait until it really gets dark, and we know that that's what it's going to be like around midnight with all the lights, etc. So we're not going to be able to go in unobserved. We drop down on the inside of the death strip, and now we start running as fast as we can. We have to cross a very wide and deep ditch, then barbed wire, then we go through a minefield, and if we've gotten that far, folks, they then had German shepherds that were trained to kill anyone other than the dog handlers. And then if you got through that, there were tripwires, and the tripwires would set off an automatic firing machine gun that would aim basically at belt level. But if you got that far and you're now at the wall, it's 10 to 12 feet high. But if you were able to reach up there and grab it at the top, you couldn't hold on because it was a curved top. And then on top of several areas along the wall, they had electrified barbed wire, pieces of which I have here. And that's what you and I would have experienced had we tried to get out. Now you're asking, why did the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps have an intelligence collection unit with offices in Berlin, Munich, as well as the Persian Gulf? Well, it is now unclassified, but as senior officers, the guys that came ahead of me, we then were the liaison to the German CIA, as well as the navies of all European NATO countries. We were 42 human intelligence collectors. 1/3 of us were West Germans, paid by the U.S. Navy. Our specialties: to debrief defectors and emigres who were escaping from behind the Iron Curtain, as well as coming out of the Middle East. We also acquired Soviet, communist bloc, as well as then in 1990 to 1991, Iraqi military equipment and weapons. All these things that we were acquiring had never been in the hands of U.S. military technical specialists to be able to study them and figure out how to defeat them. Why Berlin? Why the wall? And how significant? Well, before World War II, of course, Berlin was the capital. Michelle, I'm going to check that vodka that you gave me here. Excuse me. Hey, that's pretty good. Stolichnaya, okay. February 1945, the Yalta Conference in the Black Sea. Because the Soviet Union, by that time in World War II, because the Soviet Union had already had more than 26 million of their citizens killed, half of them were civilians. But because of that, Stalin was able to convince President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill to permit only the Soviet troops to have the pleasure of entering and conquering the city of Berlin. The idea was then, after the war, to divide Germany in half. The eastern half would basically belong to the Soviet Union, the western half to the United States, Britain, and the French. So the Soviets and we occupied our respective territories with hundreds of thousands of military personnel, facing off at what is called the inner German border. The city of Berlin was physically located in the center of the Soviet territory, and so it was divided into 4 sectors. Again, the Soviet, the American, and the British and French. Now, this next point, ladies and gentlemen, is extremely important for us to understand about the Cold War. In all U.S. and NATO war games, Berlin was so vital to Moscow that when the wall was breached, always, and I repeat, always, it initiated a nuclear World War III. Now it's unclassified, but at that time, we really, at the top secret level, we really did know what the Soviets planned to do in the real world. And that was, they planned to have a nuclear exchange over Berlin. There would be a nuclear exchange, and they were convinced that they could ride it out and they could survive, but in the West, that we would capitulate. You know, a Cold War bumper sticker might have been, to get people's attention, should have been perhaps Berlin, equal sign, a nuclear World War III, because that's what Berlin meant. That's why it was significant. After World War II, there were no walls. I mean, everybody was so busy rebuilding in Europe, especially Germany, because they really, really had incredible devastation. East Germans had unfettered access to come in to shop into the three sectors of Berlin or across the inner German border and just go to West Germany and do their shopping. Many of them were employed in the western sectors and go home at night back to the eastern side. By August of 1961, though, the East German economy was on rocks. They were really having major problems. But also consider the brain drain. Highly educated East Germans wanted to come to freedom and prosperity. The GDR president, Walter Ulbricht, was very aware that his communism was failing. So he convinced Moscow to do two things. First of all, to fund the construction of the wall, and number two, to support and back him up when he used lethal means to prevent and deter people from his country to go over the wall. August 13th, 1961, began construction on the 96-mile wall around the city of Berlin, around the three western, U.S., British, and French sectors, plus the inner German border, 870 miles from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Czech border. That was the wall that they built on the inner German border. We mostly know about the Berlin Wall, but that was part of it as well. Now, through what it meant was that the East German people became prisoners of their political system. Through the lifetime of the wall, there were an estimated 5,000 attempts to escape around Berlin as well as on the IGB. And the way they did it was they would cut the barbed wire in the early years, or they would wade through the filth of sewers. They would dig tunnels. They would curl up into the fetal position in hidden compartments in cars and trucks. And two enterprising families constructed a hot air balloon in their apartments, the successful flight of which has been recorded in an American movie called Night Crossing. Before we went to Germany, my family and I checked that one out. 200 Berliners, over 400 and some other East Germans who wanted to go over the inner German border were killed. Those are the numbers we know about. Others who were caught went into prison for lengthy periods, and their crime, treason against the GDR. But their desire to flee communism and find freedom overrode the fact that they were risking certain death. They were willing to take that chance. Now, what are some of the factors that created the foundation for the fall of the wall? First of all, 1978, Polish Cardinal Karl Wojtyła became Pope John Paul II. 2 years later, Lech Wałęsa, a Polish electrician in a shipyard who was a very devout, still is, a very devout Roman Catholic, and he helped create the Solidarity movement, which ultimately became a political party, finally opposing the Communist Party, which, of course, in communist countries was the only party permitted. 1989, Solidarity and others forced the government to have a free election. Solidarity won by a huge majority, and Lech Wałęsa, an electrician, was the president, elected as president of Poland. So you can imagine this was very encouraging as an example to their neighboring communist countries in terms of, am I down to 1 minute? Oh my goodness. Holy cow. How about that $100? I pay you for, yeah, for 5. Well, anyway, so there were other major factors. Boy, I apologize for that. Anyway, the wall did in fact come down, and you can see here people chipping away. We did that. But on November the 9th, November the 9th, the German Communist Party got together, and they were trying to figure out how to resolve the problem. They decided to go ahead and open, to lift the travel restrictions, and grand jubilation. The wall, then that night, they started tearing down the wall, and they proceeded then to, man, I've really lost it, pardon me. So the wall did in fact come down. So about 6 weeks later, on the 30th of December, my wife Sandra and 4 other members of our family and I drove over to Berlin, and on New Year's Eve, we went down to the wall, and I went up on top of it at the Brandenburg Gate. She went through. I spotted her down there. We wandered around hand in hand, just marveling at this moment of history. I mean, I couldn't believe that we were part of it. But the most important element, and as I finish up here, the most important element was that the Cold War came to an end, and not only did communism go away over time, communism went away in the Soviet Union, as well as East Germany and the Bloc, etc., but for hundreds of millions of people around the world, they became free and were relieved of this totalitarian rule. Thank you very much.